The lie that becomes the world. There's a strange thing that happens when someone becomes powerful. At first, they use power to shape the world, to move people, control narratives, and bend reality toward their will. But over time, that same power starts shaping them back. The hand that bends reality begins to forget what reality was in the first place. History is littered with people who began as visionaries and ended as delusional tyrants, believing their own propaganda, surrounded by people too afraid to tell them the truth. From kings who thought themselves gods to CEOs convinced they were revolutionaries while driving their companies into ruin, the story repeats itself with eerie precision. Why does this happen? Niccolò Machiavelli, writing in The Prince over 5 centuries ago, gave us one of the earliest blueprints for understanding this paradox. He didn't use modern psychological terms like narcissistic distortion or feedback bias, but he described the phenomenon in brutal clarity. He warned that a ruler's greatest enemy isn't rebellion, war, or even betrayal. It's illusion. The illusion that because one can bend appearances, one is the master of truth. Machiavelli hinted at what we might call a reality-bending principle. The idea that power gives people the ability to shape perception so convincingly that they begin to inhabit their own fiction. This video explores that principle, how it works, why it's inevitable, and how it consumes those who fall for it. We'll move from Renaissance politics to modern psychology, from Machiavelli's Florence to Silicon Valley and the Kremlin. Because in the end, the delusion of the powerful isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a warning for anyone who gains influence, even in miniature. Every influencer, executive, or political leader today faces the same risk that haunted princes of the past. When the world starts revolving around you, you can lose sight of the fact that you're still standing on it. 1. The Machiavellian lens, power as a creative force. Machiavelli was a realist, but not a cynic. When he wrote The Prince in 1513, he wasn't glorifying manipulation. He was dissecting it. To him, power wasn't just a tool, it was a kind of alchemy. A ruler could turn perception into political gold by mastering appearance, timing, and narrative. Men in general judge more by the eye than by the hand, he wrote, because everyone can see, but few can feel. That sentence captures his entire philosophy. Reality doesn't matter if the audience believes otherwise. And so, the successful prince learns not just to manage people, but to manage their perception of reality itself. But here's where the trap begins. Machiavelli's prince must act, convincingly and decisively, in ways that manipulate belief. Yet to do so, he must also know what's real beneath the illusion. The art of power depends on being both the director and the audience, both the deceiver and the clear-eyed observer. Few can balance that tension for long. Sooner or later, the prince starts to believe his own performance. When courtiers applaud and enemies fall silent, it's easy to confuse domination with omniscience. The stage lights blind the actor. Power, in Machiavelli's view, was always about performance. The ruler had to project strength, virtue, and inevitability, even if none of those things were strictly true. To govern, you needed to appear merciful, honest, and faithful, while being ready to act in the opposite way when necessity demanded it. This wasn't hypocrisy, Machiavelli argued, but strategy. The people see what you seem to be, only a few know what you really are. But that line, between seeming and being, is where delusion creeps in. When everyone treats you as the embodiment of destiny, how do you keep track of the lies you tell and the truths you bury? At its core, Machiavelli's reality-bending principle isn't about evil, it's about human limitation. Power magnifies perception, both in others and in oneself. The more control you have over how others see the world, the less resistance you face when your own view of it starts to warp. The prince becomes trapped inside his own myth, which at first he created to control others, but which later controls him. History's great delusional leaders, from Louis XIV to Stalin, followed that arc almost perfectly. Machiavelli didn't describe them directly, but he predicted their psychology. When power becomes performance, and performance becomes truth, madness is not a failure, it's a consequence. 2. The psychological physics of power. Power doesn't just change circumstances, it changes the mind itself. Neuroscientists today can measure what Machiavelli only intuited. When a person gains authority, their brain literally begins to function differently. The regions responsible for empathy quiet down. The dopamine systems tied to reward and anticipation surge. Risk perception changes. Power feels good, not metaphorically, but chemically. It intoxicates. That sense of elevated control, of commanding the world instead of being subject to it, reinforces confidence, even when it's unwarranted. Over time, the powerful start mistaking the feeling of being right for the fact of being right. This is the psychological seed of delusion. Machiavelli would have recognized this dynamic instantly. In The Prince, he described how rulers, once surrounded by flatterers and insulated from consequence, lose the ability to see the world as it is. The feedback loop collapses. Every word is praised, every order executed, every mistake hidden or rationalized. The few who dare to tell the truth are silenced, exiled, or executed. A wise prince, Machiavelli warned, must choose wise men for his counsel, and give them the liberty to speak the truth to him, but only when he asks it. It's brilliant advice, but it also exposes the flaw. If truth only flows when power permits it, then truth itself becomes domesticated, and when truth becomes tame, illusion rules the court. This insulation breeds what psychologists call the power paradox. The very traits that help someone rise, empathy, social intuition, adaptability, tend to erode once they attain dominance. The powerful lose touch not because they're evil or incompetent, but because their environment stops giving them honest data. They live in a simulated feedback world. Think of an emperor who believes he's adored because the streets are filled with cheering crowds, not realizing those crowds were ordered to cheer. Or the CEO who assumes morale is high because no one dares to tell him otherwise. Over time, the disconnect grows until reality itself becomes a liability, an inconvenient distraction from the story that sustains the ruler's identity. Power, in this sense, operates like gravity in reverse. It lifts the individual upward, pulling them away from the ground of shared reality. Machiavelli's genius was to see this drift not as a moral failing, but as a structural risk. It's built into the architecture of authority. The more a person can command obedience, the less they encounter resistance. And resistance, psychologically, is what keeps our perceptions accurate. Without it, even intelligent leaders begin to hallucinate competence. They start to believe that the applause means something deeper than fear. They start to think the world bends naturally toward their vision, when in truth, it bends under pressure. Pressure that always, eventually, pushes back. 3. The loop of self-delusion. Once a leader starts believing their own narrative, the distortion becomes self-sustaining. The propaganda machine that once existed to persuade others now functions to reassure the ruler. It's a closed circuit of belief, with no input from the outside world. Machiavelli understood this as a form of political entropy. The prince begins as a manipulator of appearances, and ends as a prisoner of them. He mistakes compliance for loyalty, fear for love, and applause for truth. In this state, delusion isn't just likely, it's inevitable. This feedback loop is why history's most intelligent rulers have often made catastrophic misjudgments. Napoleon thought himself invincible until Moscow's winter broke his myth. Hitler's generals feared to contradict him as he micromanaged a war he was losing. Even in the corporate world, figures like Elizabeth Holmes built entire empires on the confidence that their charisma could substitute for scientific reality, until the numbers refused to obey. Each case follows the same arc. The powerful person bends reality to fit their vision, succeeds for a time, and then fails to notice when the bending becomes breaking. The story ends not in sudden madness, but in slow insulation, the gradual replacement of reality with reflection. Machiavelli never condemned this process outright. Instead, he described it as a test of the ruler's strength of mind. The wise prince, he said, must always find a way to see through appearances, even his own. He must learn how not to be good, which in this context means learning to pierce through comforting illusions. But few can sustain that discipline. The courtier's flattery, the spectacle of obedience, the aesthetic of control, all of it conspires to tell the leader what they want to hear. You are the center of reality. In a sense, delusion is not a failure of the system, it's the system working as designed. The tragedy of the powerful is that they become most blind when they are most in control. Their victories reinforce their narratives, their followers mirror their certainty, and the machinery of perception hums perfectly, right up until the moment it doesn't. The philosopher Hannah Arendt once observed that totalitarian rulers eventually destroy their own sense of reality because they destroy the collective ability to distinguish truth from falsehood. When everything becomes a tool of power, even facts lose meaning. Machiavelli saw the early outlines of this dynamic 500 years earlier. His reality-bending principle was less a recommendation than a warning. The prince who masters illusion must never forget that illusion too obeys the laws of gravity. 4. Case studies, from princes to presidents. Power leaves fingerprints on the mind, and history gives us a record of them. The same psychological pattern that Machiavelli mapped in The Prince appears across centuries and empires. From the madness of Roman emperors to the moral disintegration of modern leaders. The names and technologies change, but the mechanism stays constant. The ruler bends perception, the world complies, and eventually, the illusion becomes the only reality they can see. The delusion doesn't arrive as a sudden descent into madness, it creeps in quietly, disguised as success. Take Nero, the Roman emperor, who believed himself an artist of divine talent. At first, Nero's obsession with performance was political. He knew that spectacle secured loyalty better than brutality. But as he ascended, the applause grew louder and the resistance weaker. He began to believe the flattery. Rome burned, and Nero sang, literally. The emperor who once used illusion as strategy came to live inside it. His performances no longer served the empire. The empire existed to serve his performances. Machiavelli would have recognized Nero's downfall instantly. The prince who believes his own theater has ceased to rule reality and become its captive. His Rome became a stage set. His empire, a hallucination, held together by fear until it collapsed under the weight of his self-worship. Then there's Napoleon Bonaparte, one of history's most complex embodiments of Machiavellian brilliance, and delusion. Napoleon began as the quintessential realist, pragmatic, shrewd, disciplined. He understood that power came not from divine right but from perception, the army's faith, the people's awe, the enemy's fear. For years he wielded that perception with surgical precision, crafting an image of invincibility. But as victories piled up, that image hardened into self-belief. The general who once studied maps with obsessive realism began to imagine himself as destiny incarnate. His invasion of Russia in 1812 wasn't a tactical decision, it was an act of myth-making, an attempt to stretch his legend across the continent. When his army froze in the snow, reality reasserted itself. The little corporal who had mastered appearance became the prisoner of his own narrative. Machiavelli's principle had played itself out with perfect cruelty. The man who once controlled perception was consumed by it. The pattern repeats in the modern era, though the thrones look different. Elizabeth Holmes, founder of Theranos, began as a visionary who borrowed the language of disruption to challenge the medical establishment. Her image, black turtleneck, unblinking stare, the female Steve Jobs, was her power. Investors, media, and the public all believed in the story she told, even when the data contradicted it. Holmes didn't simply deceive others, she deceived herself. Like a modern prince of Silicon Valley, she built a kingdom of illusion where charisma replaced competence. The tragedy of Theranos isn't just fraud, it's belief turned inward, the moment when persuasion replaces perception. Machiavelli's reality-bending principle had found a new medium in the startup mythos. Narrative becomes value, image becomes proof, and truth becomes optional. And then there's Vladimir Putin, perhaps the most textbook Machiavellian ruler alive. For 2 decades, he has weaponized perception, controlling media, rewriting history, staging victories both military and symbolic. His power depends on maintaining the illusion of control and inevitability. Yet, over time, the illusion begins to feed itself. The leader who manipulates propaganda to project strength starts believing in that strength absolutely. The invasion of Ukraine in 2022 revealed the dangerous convergence of power and delusion, strategic miscalculations born from a belief that the world would obey the narrative. Putin's Russia, like Nero's Rome or Napoleon's France, shows how Machiavelli's principle never fades. It simply evolves with technology. Propaganda, once whispered in courts, now flows through screens. What unites Nero, Napoleon, Holmes, and Putin is not mere arrogance. It's the structural blindness of power itself, the way influence isolates its possessor from correction. Each began by bending reality to achieve control, each ended by mistaking their own distortion for truth. Machiavelli's insight wasn't that power corrupts, but that it distorts perception. The ruler who cannot resist their own illusion eventually rules nothing at all, because reality, no matter how long denied, always demands its due. 5. The modern Machiavellian, corporate and political parallels. In the 21st century, Machiavelli's reality-bending principle has gone mainstream. We no longer live under monarchs or emperors, but the psychological architecture of power remains the same. Today, leaders, political, corporate, or digital, have unprecedented tools to manufacture perception. The court has become the algorithm, and the courtiers are followers, bots, and brand consultants. Yet the risk Machiavelli warned about has only intensified. When perception becomes programmable, delusion becomes scalable. Modern corporations operate as laboratories of controlled reality. A CEO can shape not just internal culture, but public narrative through media appearances, social campaigns, and digital storytelling. When stock prices depend more on confidence than substance, illusion becomes an economic force. Consider how tech visionaries like Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg construct grand narratives around innovation and destiny. Whether one admires or criticizes them, Their success depends on their ability to make people believe, investors, employees, and entire markets. The danger emerges when belief stops serving the company and starts serving the ego. In the feedback loop of fame and influence, truth becomes negotiable. What matters isn't what's real, but what trends. And when a leader lives long enough in that simulation, reality becomes the enemy. Politics has followed the same path. The modern politician is less a governor than a performer navigating perpetual spectacle. Every speech, tweet, or photo is part of an ongoing narrative machine designed to sustain power through perception. The result is a class of leaders who are masters of performance but novices of substance. They can mobilize emotion, control discourse, and curate their own myth in real time. But as Machiavelli would warn, the more control they exert over appearances, the more they risk believing them. When political theater becomes indistinguishable from governance, reality itself becomes a stage prop, until something unignorable, like a pandemic or war, rips the set apart. The digital age has democratized Machiavellianism. Everyone with a smartphone can bend perception, shaping their image, curating their world, and broadcasting their version of truth. But this also means that everyone, in miniature, faces the same risk once reserved for kings. The influencer who builds a persona online starts to live by it. The executive who performs confidence on LinkedIn begins to feel it as identity. The feedback loops of likes and shares mimic the echo chambers of royal courts. The result is a society where power, whether over millions or a few thousand followers, consistently rewards illusion. Machiavelli's warning wasn't just political, it was existential. The more we bend reality for approval, the harder it becomes to remember what's real. 6. The collapse of the illusion. Every illusion eventually meets its limit. Reality has a cruel patience. It waits. When the gap between perception and truth stretches too far, something always snaps. For the powerful, that moment of reckoning is often swift, catastrophic, and public. The same audience that once believed the myth turns against it. The courtiers flee, the advisors distance themselves, and the applause stops. The stage lights go out, and the ruler, for the first time in years, stands alone in the dark, face to face with the world as it truly is. Machiavelli foresaw this collapse with surgical precision. He wrote that fortuna, is like a river that can be dammed, diverted, and managed for a time, but never fully controlled. When a ruler begins to believe they can control fortune itself, destruction follows. In Machiavelli's terms, delusion is a kind of defiance of nature. The prince thinks his power can override chance, weather, and the will of others. But reality has a way of humbling even the most gifted illusionists. Nero met revolt. Napoleon met winter. Elizabeth Holmes met the courtroom. Each downfall was simply reality's correction, the moment truth returned from exile. Psychologically, the collapse of illusion is devastating because it requires confronting the gap between who one is and who one believed oneself to be. The higher the illusion, the harder the fall. Power, by isolating its holder, deprives them of gradual corrections. Ordinary people get small doses of reality every day. A friend's criticism, a failed project, a loss. The powerful are shielded from those micro-failures until all the errors accumulate and hit at once. That's why when the fall comes, it feels biblical. The delusional leader is suddenly forced to experience the world as others always did, stripped of narrative control. And that moment, when myth meets fact, is often the end, politically or psychologically. In Machiavelli's eyes, survival depended on the rarest skill of all, the capacity to face truth without flinching, even when the truth dismantles one's own legend. Yet collapse is not just destruction, it's revelation. In Machiavelli's paradoxical realism, the moment of unmasking is also the only moment of genuine freedom. When the illusion breaks, the ruler, or any person intoxicated by power, finally regains contact with the ground. They see that control was never absolute, that perception was never reality, that power itself was never ownership of truth but merely a temporary command of appearances. Most can't bear that awareness. But a few, the rare leaders Machiavelli admired, like Cesare Borgia before his downfall, understand that to rule reality, one must first respect it. To ignore it is to become its victim. Conclusion: the price of bending reality. Machiavelli's reality-bending principle is not just a political insight. It's a mirror held up to human ambition. The deeper lesson is that reality resists manipulation in the long run. The powerful, by reshaping how others see the world, often lose sight of it themselves. What begins as mastery of appearances turns into dependence on them. The ruler's image, once a tool, becomes a prison. And while Machiavelli advised princes to master illusion, he never told them to believe it. That distinction between wielding deception and being deceived by it is what separates the enduring realist from the doomed visionary. In today's world, that warning has expanded far beyond palaces and parliaments. We live in an age of micropower, where everyone curates their reality through screens, posts, and narratives. Each of us becomes a minor Machiavelli, shaping perception to earn validation. But the same risk applies. When the performance becomes identity, we lose track of what's authentic. The delusion of the powerful becomes the delusion of the crowd, the belief that image can permanently substitute for truth. Reality, however, always reclaims its territory. Sometimes it does so gently, through failure, loss, or confrontation. Sometimes violently, through collapse, exposure, or crisis. Either way, the laws Machiavelli observed in princes still govern us all. The ultimate irony of power is that it gives the illusion of control while secretly eroding it. The more a leader bends reality, the less they can see it clearly. The more they command obedience, the fewer honest voices remain. The delusion that begins as strategy ends as fate. And so, Machiavelli's warning echoes across time. Those who rule must see the world as it is, not as they wish it to be. To deny reality is to invite ruin. The prince, who cannot look truth in the eye, is not powerful at all. He is merely protected from consequence. And protection is not strength, it is blindness disguised as safety. If there's a single takeaway from Machiavelli's reality-bending principle, it's this: power distorts perception, and perception, unchallenged, becomes delusion. The challenge for any leader, or any human being with influence, is to keep their grip on the real, even when the world reflects only what they want to see. Because reality is patient, and it never negotiates. Sooner or later, it reasserts itself, and when it does, it reminds every ruler, every celebrity, every influencer, and every one of us of the same unbreakable truth, that power doesn't make us gods. It only tests how human we remain while holding it.